Good evening, YouTube. On Human Capital, from Human Capital, from the chapter Cultural Factors in Wealth, Poverty, and Politics, an International Perspective by Thomas Sowell. Human capital is important, not just in helping a country recover from devastating losses of physical capital, such as after a war. It is also a major factor in economic progress in normal times. Human capital is in fact the biggest difference between ourselves and the caveman. There is a tendency by some to equate human capital with education. No doubt, education is one of the varieties of human capital. While years of education are often used as a rough proxy for human capital in general, not only is much human capital gained outside of educational institutions, some education develops little or no human capital when it produces few, if any, marketable skills. And some education even produces negative human capital in the form of attitudes, expectations, and aversions that negatively impact the economy. Depending on its content, education may sometimes create ideological aversions to working in the private sector or a refusal to do anything that does not seem to qualify as, quote, meaningful work, unquote. That is, work spontaneously agreeable and fulfilling in itself. The Industrial Revolution was not created primarily by people with such formal education. It was in fact largely the work of people with practical job skills and experience, rather than a mastery of science or systematic study of engineering. The Industrial Revolution was already well underway before formal study of science and engineering became widespread, even in later times. Such industrial pioneers as Thomas Edison and Henry Ford had very little formal education. The Wright brothers were high school dropouts, and in the electronic age, Bill Gates and Michael Dell were dropouts from college. In short, human capital is not synonymous with formal schooling. Just as human capital takes other forms besides education, so there can be widespread education without equally widespread human capital. Russia, in the 21st century, has been called a society characterized by high levels of education but low levels of human capital. Among the more directly economic aspects of this is that while Russia has about 6% of the world's college-educated population, it has less than 1/5 of 1% of the world's new patents and patent applications. During the years from 1995 to 2008, Germany produced about 60 times as many patents as Russia, Japan, nearly 200 times as many patents, and the United States, about 500 times as many patents. Even the small city-state of Singapore produced more patents than Russia. None of this says that education is unimportant, but both in importance as one form of human capital and its distribution requires specific scrutiny rather than general celebration. Here, as elsewhere, few things are equal among individuals, groups, or nations. Even among college-educated people in different societies and cultures, disparities are both common and large. Education as a cultural value. The effects of differences between the way different cultures value education do not end with the effect of differences in literacy rates, even though literacy is a fundamental factor in the fate of individuals, groups, and nations. Different cultures differ not only in the amount of education people seek, but also in what kinds of education they seek, and in the qualitative levels they achieve in that education. Comparisons of people from different social groups with the, quote, same, unquote, education measured in years of schooling miss the other dimensions of education, and can therefore often falsely ascribe discrimination with the rewards differ when the rewards differ among individuals from different social, racial, or other groups with ostensibly the, quote, same, unquote, education as measured by years in school. It is not uncommon for some culturally distinct minority to have not only more education, but also qualitatively better education than the surrounding majority population, either in terms of education in intellectually more challenging specialties or in terms of higher individual achievements in their education. In 1972, most of the A's on university entrance exams in Sri Lanka went to members of the Tamil minority, rather than members of the Sinhalese majority. During the days of the Ottoman Empire, Armenian students outperformed students from the Turkish majority, and even wrote better in Ottoman Turkish language than Turkish students did. Choices of educational specialties can also differ greatly among groups with different cultures in the same society. In Malaysia, during the 1960s, when university admissions were still based on academic qualifications, there were more university students from the Chinese minority than from the Malay majority. The disparity was essentially great in mathematical, scientific, and technological specialties. During the 1960s, Chinese students received 1,488 Bachelors of Science degrees in Malaysia, while Malay students received just 69. In engineering, Chinese students received 408 bachelor's degrees during the decade of the 1960s, while Malay students received just 4. In Germany, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Jewish students were similarly statistically overrepresented in German universities, as they were in other times and places, whether in Eastern Europe, Argentina, or Australia. Today, in New York City's 3 elite and highly selective academic public high schools, Stuyvesant, Bronx Science, and Brooklyn Tech, Asian students outnumber white students by more than 2 to 1. This is in a city where Asians are only 14% of the public school students. By contrast, majority groups that are lagging economically tend also to lag educationally, both quantitatively and qualitatively. As university students, they tend to specialize in easier subjects rather than subjects like mathematics, science, or engineering. This in turn often leads to less promising careers or to unemployment. What one study referred to as the, quote, well-educated but underemployed, unquote, Czech young men in the 19th century had many counterparts in other countries in the 20th century, when the, quote, educated unemployed, unquote, became a common expression, whether in Europe, Asia, or elsewhere. People who have acquired academic degrees without acquiring many economically meaningful skills not only face personal disappointment and disaffection with society, but also have often become negative factors in the economy and even sources of danger, especially when they lash out at economically successful minorities and ethnically polarize the whole society they live in. In various Eastern European countries between the 2 world wars, such newly educated young members of lagging majorities provided much of the membership of anti-Semitic movements, which became politically powerful, leading to discrimination and even violence against Jewish students in universities. Not only were frustrated young graduates from majority populations, many the first generation of their families to reach higher education, among the disaffected who blame better prepared minorities for their own lags. The intelligentsia of lagging groups have likewise promoted group identity ideology and group identity politics. This pattern extended far beyond Eastern Europe. In many places and many times, soft subject students and intellectuals have inflamed hostility and sometimes violence against many other successful groups, whether in India, Hungary, Nigeria, Kazakhstan, Romania, Sri Lanka, Canada, or Czechoslovakia. In contemporary America, many colleges and universities have whole departments devoted to promoting a sense of racial and ethnic grievances against others, while celebrating the isolation of group identities epitomized by ethnically separate residences on campus and sometimes even ethnically separate graduation ceremonies. As in other places and times, whether in Europe, Asia, or elsewhere, the intelligentsia of lagging groups have celebrated and or fabricated past glories of these groups in the interest of trying to retain individuals who might otherwise be tempted to rise into the larger society. When the author of the celebrated American book and television miniseries Roots was challenged on its accuracy by historians, his response was, quote, "I was just trying to give my people a myth to live by," unquote. This approach was by no means unique to blacks or to the United States. An international study of ethnic groups found, quote, cultural revivals, unquote, to be a, quote, response, unquote, reflecting, again, quote, an awareness of the danger of a fading group identity, unquote. Daniel Patrick Moynihan said of his fellow Irish Americans, "The cruel part of this history is that by 1916, Irish nationalism in America had little to do with Ireland. It was a hodgepodge of fine feeling and bad history with which the immigrants filled a cultural void." Preoccupation with past glories, even when they are genuine, can be an impediment to receptivity to current advances available from other cultures, as we have seen in the case of China and the Middle East. The pursuit of accurate knowledge and the pursuit of ideological satisfaction have been conflicting goals, whether in American universities today or in universities in other times and places. A history of East Central Europe between the two world wars characterized Romanian universities in that era as, quote, numerically swollen, academically rather lax, and politically overheated, unquote, serving as, again, veritable incubators of surplus bureaucrats, politicians, and demagogues, unquote. Decades later, universities in Sri Lanka likewise had a backlog of unemployed graduates who had specialized in humanities and the social sciences. Despite beliefs in some quarters that education makes people more tolerant of other cultures and groups, it has been precisely such newly educated groups, often lacking marketable skills, who have promoted group polarization, whether in Europe, Asia, or Africa. As a noted African scholar observed, the educated Nigerian is the worst peddler of tribalism. It was much the same story with the 19th century Czech intelligentsia, including university students and school teachers who promoted Czech cultural nationalism. Among their demands were that street signs in Prague, which were in both Czech and German, would be exclusively in Czech. In the town of Budweis, Czech cultural nationalists demanded that there be a quota of Czech music to be played by the town orchestra. There has been a similar insistent pettiness about language in similar circumstances in 20th century Quebec, where laws required that not only street signs be solely in French, but also imposed legal restrictions on the use of English inside private businesses. Quebec authorities even tried to force pilots to communicate in French with air traffic controllers when landing or taking off. Only a threatened international pilot boycott of Quebec forced the local authorities to back down on this dangerous demand, that lives be risked by communication in unfamiliar language. Even aside from ethnic issues, more years of schooling cannot automatically be equated with increased human capital. Everything depends on whether more years in schools colleges and universities actually create economically meaningful skills, or whether academic credentials create a sense of entitlement beyond what the holders of those credentials actually produce. This is not to say that economic benefits are the only benefits of education, but it is to say that expectations or claims of entitlement to higher incomes or wealth have no basis unless the specific kinds of education, the specific qualitative levels of that education actually create sufficient additional output to cover the additional income or wealth expected. When individuals from lagging groups, whether racial, regional, or other social groups, tend to take less challenging courses, especially when these individuals are the first generation of their respective families to reach the college or university level, such individuals are unlikely to create as valuable services as people who study such obviously useful things as medicine, science, or technology. In many poorer countries, especially the, quote, educated unemployed, unquote, are often numerous enough to be not only a major disappointment, but a social and political danger. Even many of those with academic credentials, but no economically meaningful skills, who are in fact employed, are often employed in government bureaucracies, since they are unlikely to be much in demand in competitive markets where employers are spending their own money rather than spending the taxpayers' money. Sometimes jobs in government bureaucracies may be created in order to absorb large numbers of young people who could otherwise be frustrated and embittered enough to be politically troublesome for government officials or even dangerous to the society at large. In poor countries, especially, swollen bureaucracies and the red tape they generate are often an impediment to economic activity by people who do have the human capital to advance the economy and create much needed rises in living standards for the society at large.